A deafening, monotonous screech echoed as my heart monitor flatlined in an entirely empty hospital room. Dying at 25 was a lonely affair. My body irreparably destroyed by the kidney I was forced to harvest for my golden child's sister. My parents hadn't even bothered to visit. They were too busy touring wedding venues for her. As my vision faded into a suffocating blackness, the bitter taste of a wasted, unloved life choked me. I prayed to whatever was listening for just one thing: pure, unadulterated vengeance. Blinking, the sterile ceiling vanished, instantly replaced by glow-in-the-dark plastic stars. I wasn't dead. I was 4 years old again. And this time, I was packing my things and walking away forever. The smell hit me first. It was a suffocating mix of stale dust, mothballs, and the faint, sickeningly sweet scent of my mother's signature. Gardenia perfume lingering in the hallway. I bolted upright, my lungs gasping for air that didn't feel like it was being pushed through fluid. I clawed at my chest. There were no wires, no IV drips, no sharp, agonizing ache in my lower back where the surgeon had sliced me open to harvest my kidney for Sophia. Instead, my hands, tiny, plump, and unscarred, met the soft, worn cotton of a faded yellow pajama top. I stared at my hands in the dim light. I turned them over, examining the lack of calluses, the absence of the track marks from endless blood draws. I looked around the room. It wasn't a room, not really. It was the oversized walk-in closet adjoining the guest bedroom, a space Beatrice and Arthur had deemed cozy enough for their second-born, while Sophia enjoyed the master suite down the hall. Panic, thick and icy, surged up my throat. I scrambled out of the small toddler bed, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. I rushed to the mirrored sliding doors of the main bedroom and stared at my reflection. A child stared back at me. Big, terrified blue eyes, tangled dark hair, and cheeks that still held the roundness of infancy. I was 4. How? My mind violently fractured, caught between the agonizing memories of a 25-year-old dying alone in a sterile county hospital and the present reality of this tiny, vulnerable body. I remembered the exact moment my heart stopped. I remembered the doctor looking at his watch, shaking his head. I remembered the voicemails I had left on Arthur's phone, begging for him to come, begging for the insurance co-pay money they had promised me after I saved Sophia's life. "Stop being so dramatic, Chloe." Beatrix's voice echoed in my memory. A recording from just 3 days before my death. "Sophia is trying to pick out her floral arrangements. We don't have time for your anxiety attacks. Take an aspirin, they let me die. I was born to be a spare part, a shadow, a convenient punching bag. And when I was no longer useful, I was discarded." I slumped against the mirror, sliding down until I hit the floor. I didn't cry. The tears had completely dried up in my previous life. Instead, a cold, burning clarity began to spread through my chest. If this was a dream, it was a terrifyingly vivid one. But as I pinched my arm, feeling the sharp sting of pain, I knew it wasn't. It was July 12, 2002. I knew this date. It was burned into my psyche, discussed in years of therapy that I had paid for out of my own meager pockets in my 20s. Today was the day of the accident. Today was the day Arthur and Beatrice would pack the car for our annual trip to the summer house in Lake George. Today was the day they would stop at the bustling interstate gas station, get out to buy Sophia her favorite imported chocolates, and leave me sleeping in the back seat. Today was the day I would wake up, get terrified, wander out of the car to find them, and they would drive away without me. In my past life, I had wandered that gas station for 8 terrifying hours. I was nearly abducted by a stranger before a trucker finally called the police. When Arthur and Beatrice finally drove back to get me at midnight, they didn't apologize. They yelled at me. Beatrice had slapped my face so hard, my lips split, screaming that I had ruined their vacation by running away. From that day on, I was branded the problem child, the unruly burden, cementing my role as the family scapegoat. I looked down at my tiny 4-year-old hands. They were trembling, but not from fear. They were trembling with rage. "Chloe," the sharp, shrill voice of my mother shattered the morning silence. "Beatrice, if you aren't dressed and packed in 5 minutes, you're not getting any breakfast. I swear to God, you are impossibly slow." The old me would have scrambled. The old me would have tripped over my own feet, desperately trying to pull on my clothes, crying, eager to please a mother who was fundamentally incapable of loving me. The old me spent 25 years begging for a scrap of affection from a woman who looked at me like I was an infestation. The new me, the 25-year-old woman possessing this child's body. I stood up, my face perfectly calm. "I won't need breakfast, Beatrice," I whispered to the empty room. I walked back into my closet room. I had 5 minutes. Today, the accident was going to happen again. But this time, I wasn't going to be a terrified victim wandering a parking lot. This time I was going to pack my things, walk away, and make sure Arthur and Beatrice never ever got me back. I moved with a precision and urgency that didn't belong to a toddler. I reached under my bed and pulled out my little red backpack. It had a cartoon dog on it, a mocking symbol of childhood innocence that I no longer possessed. What does a person need to start a new life? In my past life, I left home at 18 with nothing but a trash bag of clothes. It had taken me years to get my vital documents, years of Arthur holding my birth certificate hostage to force me to attend family dinners and endure their abuse. Not this time. I unzipped the backpack. I bypassed the toys. I grabbed a single change of practical clothes, jeans and a thick sweater, and shoved them to the bottom. I grabbed my favorite worn-out blanket not for comfort, but because the nights on the road or in the system could be cold. Then I slipped out of the closet. The hallway was quiet. Beatrice was downstairs making her usual elaborate breakfast for Sophia, and Arthur was likely in his study, going over last-minute emails before the vacation. I crept toward Arthur's study. The door was slightly ajar. I peeked through the crack. Arthur was sitting at his mahogany desk, his back to me, typing aggressively on his laptop. He was a tall man, imposing, with a sharp jawline and a sharper temper. I knew his habits. I knew them because I had spent my entire adult life analyzing them, trying to figure out why I was never good enough for him. I knew that he kept a fireproof lockbox in the bottom right drawer of his desk. And I knew that he never locked it while he was in the room working. I waited. My heart pounded against my tiny ribs like a trapped bird. "Arthur!" Beatrice yelled from the kitchen. "The espresso machine is acting up again." "Come fix it," Arthur sighed heavily, muttering an expletive under his breath. He slammed the laptop shut, stood up, and stormed out of the study, heading toward the kitchen. He didn't even glance down as he passed the doorway where I was flattened against the wall. The moment his footsteps faded down the stairs, I darted into the study. The desk was massive, towering over my 4-year-old frame. I had to drag the heavy leather desk chair over to the drawers, climbing up onto it like a monkey. I pulled the bottom right drawer open. The heavy black firebox sat there, the latch unfastened. I flicked it open. Inside were stacks of neatly organized files, passports, deeds, insurance policies. I dug my small fingers into the manila folders until I found the one labeled Dependents. There it was. Sophia's thick, comprehensive medical file, her birth certificate, her passport, and behind it a single flimsy piece of paper, my birth certificate, social security card clipped to the top. I grabbed them, folding them clumsily but tightly, and shoved them deep into the pockets of my jeans. But I didn't stop there. I knew Arthur kept emergency cash in this box, an envelope of crisp $100 bills just in case. I found the thick white envelope beneath the folders. A 4-year-old with $100 is suspicious. A 4-year-old with $3,000 is a massive red flag that will force authorities to take the situation seriously. I took the entire envelope and stuffed it down the front of my shirt. I climbed down, pushed the chair back to its exact position, and slipped out of the room just as I heard Arthur's heavy footsteps ascending the stairs. I ducked back into my closet room, panting softly. I had my identity. I had capital. Now I needed the exit strategy. I finished dressing myself, putting on a plain yellow t-shirt and overalls, ensuring the documents and cash were securely transferred into the hidden inner pocket of my red backpack. I zipped it up tight, slipping my arms through the straps. It felt heavy, but it grounded me. "Chloe, get down here right now," Beatrice's voice cracked like a whip. I walked down the grand sweeping staircase of our suburban McMansion. In the bright sunlit kitchen, a scene of domestic bliss was playing out. 6-year-old Sophia, with her perfectly curled blonde hair and pristine pink dress, was sitting at the island, happily eating a plate of Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes smothered in syrup. Beatrice was wiping a drop of syrup from Sophia's chin with a gentle, adoring smile. The contrast made my stomach churn. For 25 years, this image had broken my heart. Now it only hardened it. Beatrice turned to look at me, and her smile instantly vanished, replaced by a scowl of deep annoyance. "Look at you," she sneered. "Your hair is a rat's nest. Did you even try to brush it? And why are you wearing those awful overalls? I bought you that nice blue dress for the trip. It's uncomfortable in the car," I said. My voice was high-pitched, childish, but my tone was utterly flat. It lacked the usual whine or desperation of a child. Beatrice blinked, momentarily taken aback by my deadpan delivery. She shook her head. "Whatever. I don't have the energy to fight with you today. Eat your toast. We leave in 10 minutes. She pointed to a cold, unbuttered piece of toast sitting on a paper towel at the far end of the counter. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I walked over, picked up the dry toast, and took a bite. It tasted like ash, but I swallowed it down. I needed the energy. Arthur entered the kitchen, carrying his briefcase. "Car is packed. Sophia Pumpkin, you ready to go to the lake?" "Yes, Daddy." Sophia cheered, jumping off her stool. "Go get in the car, Chloe." Arthur barked at me, not making eye contact. "And don't kick the back of my seat this time, or I swear I'll turn the car around and leave you at an orphanage." It was an empty threat he used often. It used to make me sob and tear. Today, a grim, humorless smile touched my lips. "You won't have to leave me anywhere, Arthur," I thought, chewing the dry toast. "I'm leaving you." The car ride was an agonizing stretch of forced silence. Arthur drove with aggressive tension, constantly swearing at the traffic. Beatrice sat in the passenger seat, applying makeup and twisting around every 5 minutes to check on Sophia, who was happily watching a movie on a portable DVD player. I sat in the back right corner, pressed against the cold leather, staring out the window. My red backpack was securely nestled beneath my feet. I didn't make a sound. I didn't ask for water. I didn't complain about having to use the bathroom. I was a ghost observing the people who had murdered me in another life. 2 hours into the trip, the familiar green signs for the Pioneers rest stop appeared on the highway. My pulse quickened. This was it. The ground zero of my childhood trauma. "I need to stretch my legs," Arthur announced, hitting the turn signal. "And get some coffee." "Oh, perfect." "Sophia wants those imported Swiss chocolates they sell in the gift shop here," Beatrice said, unbuckling her seatbelt before the car even fully stopped. Arthur pulled the massive SUV into a parking spot near the front of the large, sprawling rest stop complex. It was a bustling hub in the middle of nowhere, featuring a gas station, a diner, a gift shop, and an adjoining state trooper outpost. "Daddy, I want to pick them out," Sophia wed. "Of course, sweetie. Come with us," Arthur said, his voice instantly softening. He turned off the engine. They all opened their doors. "Chloe, stay in the car. We'll be right back." "Don't touch anything," Beatrice commanded, slamming her door shut. Arthur locked the car from the outside using his key fob. Click. In my past life, I had fallen asleep. When I woke up, the car was sweltering hot. I had panicked, thinking they had abandoned me forever. I managed to manually unlock the door from the inside, pushed it open, and wandered into the massive crowd of tourists, instantly getting lost. By the time I realized I was lost, Arthur and Beatrice had returned to the car, assumed I was hiding to be a brat, and in a fit of pure, unadulterated rage and negligence, Arthur had simply driven away, assuming I would learn my lesson. They left me there. This time I didn't sleep. The moment the click of the lock sounded, my hands shot out to the door handle. I watched them walk away. I watched Beatrice holding Sophia's hand, laughing at something Arthur said. They didn't look back once. They never looked back at me. I pulled the manual lock up. I grabbed my red backpack, slipping my small arms through the straps. I pulled the heavy door handle, putting all my 4-year-old weight into it until the door swung open. The heavy, humid July air washed over me. I stepped out onto the asphalt. I didn't wander aimlessly. I didn't cry for my mommy. I looked at the massive complex. To the left was the gift shop where my family was currently browsing. To the far right, past the gas pumps, was a small brick building with a fleet of distinctive black and white vehicles parked outside the State Highway Patrol outpost. I closed the SUV door softly, making sure it clicked shut. I didn't look back at the car. I adjusted my backpack and began to walk. The parking lot was dangerous for a child. Massive trucks rumbled by, cars backed up without looking. I stayed close to the concrete planters, making myself small, moving with a deliberate, calculated pace. A few adults gave me odd looks, a solitary toddler marching across a busy truck stop. But people are inherently selfish. Nobody stopped to ask where my parents were. That was fine. I didn't want their help. I needed an ironclad legal record of abandonment. I reached the glass doors of the State Patrol outpost. The handles were too high. I stood on my tiptoes, gripping the cold metal and yanked with all my might. It didn't budge. "Ooh there, little one." A deep, booming voice came from behind me. I turned. A towering state trooper holding a cup of steaming coffee was looking down at me. He had a thick mustache and kind crinkling eyes. His name tag read, Sergeant Miller. "You're a long way from the candy aisle," Miller said, a gentle smile on his face. He looked around the immediate area. "Where are your folks, sweetheart? Did you get separated?" I looked up at him. I had practiced this moment in my head 1,000 times since waking up in that closet this morning. I had to play the part, but I had to be precise. I widened my eyes, letting them fill with unshed tears. A parlor trick I had learned in my 20s to get out of parking tickets, now deployed for my very survival. My mommy and daddy left me," I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. Miller's smile vanished instantly. The coffee cup in his hand tilted, splashing a drop onto the concrete. The relaxed, friendly officer disappeared, replaced by a sharp, alert professional. "Left you. Are they in the restrooms?" "Let's go find them," he said, reaching a massive hand out toward me. I took a step back, shaking my head violently. "No, they drove away. They said I was bad. They said they didn't want me anymore." It was a lie. They hadn't driven away yet. They were likely still in the gift shop buying chocolate. But I needed Miller to trigger an immediate high-level response. If he just walked me back to the car, Beatrice would put on her fake Mother of the Year act, claim I wandered off, and slap me the second we were alone. Miller's jaw tightened. They drove away. "When?" "Just now." I lied smoothly in a big black car. "They locked the doors and told me to stay forever." Okay. "Don't you worry, sweetie, you're safe with me," Miller said, his voice low and serious. He opened the heavy glass door and gently ushered me inside into the blast of air conditioning. The outpost was small, just a front desk and a few desks in the back. A female officer, Officer Davis, looked up from her computer. "Miller? Who's your friend?" she asked. "Possible abandonment." "Since drove off," Miller said grimly. Davis stood up immediately, her expression hardening. "Jesus, again? This is the third time this summer at this stop." She hurried around the desk, crouching down to my eye level. "Hi there, honey. I'm Officer Davis. What's your name?" "Chloe," I said softly. "Okay, Chloe. Can you tell me your last name?" I nodded. I unzipped my red backpack and reached inside. I bypassed the stuffed bear and the extra clothes. I pulled out the crisp, neatly folded piece of paper and handed it to her. Officer Davis took the paper, unfolding it. Her eyes scanned the document and her eyebrows shot up into her hairline. She looked at Miller, then back at me. "Miller," she said, her voice tight. "This is an original state-certified birth certificate and a social security card." Miller frowned, stepping closer to look. "A 4-year-old is carrying her own vital documents." "My daddy told me to take my things," I lied, looking at the floor. "He gave me this." I reached into my overalls and pulled out the thick white envelope of cash, tossing it onto the desk. The flap fell open, revealing the thick stack of $100 bills. The silence in the room was absolute. Miller and Davis stared at the money, then at me, the air thick with disbelief and rising horror. $3,000. Miller breathed, looking at the cash. He looked back down at me, his eyes filled with a terrifying realization of the narrative I was spinning. "They gave you $3,000, your papers, and left you at a truck stop. They said it was severance," I said, using a word a 4-year-old shouldn't know, a calculated risk to emphasize the cold corporate nature of Arthur's abuse. "They said Sophia is the only daughter they need." Locked down the highway, Davis snapped at Miller, her voice trembling with fury as she stood up. "Get every unit on Interstate 87 looking for a black SUV. Get down here right now," Beatrice's vote fact from her. "I'm calling Child Protective Services." I sat in a plastic chair as the station erupted into organized chaos. Radios buzzed, Descriptions of Arthur and Beatrice were barked across county lines. I sat there swinging my small legs, sipping a juice box Davis had given me. Outside, through the window, I saw Arthur and Beatrice walk out of the gift shop. Sophia was happily eating a chocolate bar. They walked to the SUV. I watched Arthur unlock it. I watched him open his door, pause, and look in the back seat. Even from 100 yards away, I could see his body go rigid. He slammed the door. He turned to Beatrice, gesturing wildly. They hadn't driven off. They were right there. And within 60 seconds, 2 state patrol cruisers with sirens blaring would corner their car in the parking lot. They would be arrested on suspicion of child abandonment and endangerment. Their wild claims that I had simply run away, completely destroyed by the fact that I had my birth certificate and $3,000 in severance cash. I took a slow sip of my apple juice. The sweet taste washed over my tongue. Checkmate, mother. Through the reinforced glass of the highway outpost, I watched the spectacular collapse of my former abusers. The state troopers hadn't been gentle when Talbot and Eleanor names I now forced myself to use in my mind, stripping them of the parental titles they never deserved, were confronted at their vehicle. Talbot had immediately become belligerent. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew his body language intimately. The puffed-out chest, the aggressive pointing, the veins bulging in his neck. In his world, a mid-level tech executive with a six-figure salary didn't get questioned by rural highway patrolmen. It was a fatal miscalculation. Within seconds, Officer Mitchell, a seasoned trooper who had no patience for wealthy arrogance, had Talbot spun around and pressed hard against the side of the black SUV, cuffs clicking shut around his wrists. Eleanor screamed, dropping her designer handbag, her perfect manicured facade shattering as a female officer firmly grabbed her arms. 6-year-old Lily stood on the asphalt, clutching her imported chocolate, completely bewildered. I took another sip of my apple juice, the cold, sweet liquid, a stark contrast to the burning satisfaction in my chest. In my previous 25 years of life, I had never seen them face a single consequence. They had always bought, manipulated, or intimidated their way out of accountability. But you can't buy your way out of a state-certified birth certificate, $3,000 in perfectly traceable cash, and a highly articulate 4-year-old claiming severance. Officer Davis walked back into the room, her expression grim but her eyes softening as she looked at me. Chloe, or well, sweetheart, I should say, she began gently. We've got them in custody. A social worker from Child Protective Services is on her way. Her name is Valerie, and she's very nice. Are they going to jail? I asked, keeping my voice small, perfectly modulating the pitch to sound innocent rather than vindictive. They have a lot of explaining to do, Davis said carefully. You don't have to worry about them hurting you or leaving you ever again. I promise. 2 hours later, Valerie Sanchez arrived. She was a tired-looking woman in her late 30s, carrying a battered leather tote bag and an expression of permanent heavy empathy. Valerie was exactly the kind of bleeding heart social worker Talbot used to mock at his dinner parties. She knelt in front of my plastic chair. Hi there, sweetie. I'm Valerie. We're going to go for a little ride to a safe place, okay? I nodded silently, slipping off the chair and grabbing my red backpack. I didn't cling to her, but I didn't resist. I played the role of the shell-shock survivor flawlessly. The drive to the temporary placement facility was quiet. I stared out the window of Valerie's modest sedan, watching the July sun begin to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the highway. Behind the scenes, I knew exactly what was happening. Talbot and Eleanor would be placed in holding cells. They would demand to call their corporate lawyer, attorney Daniel Kessler, a ruthless fixer who usually handled their business contracts. But Kessler wasn't a criminal defense attorney, and he certainly wasn't equipped to handle a felony child abandonment case with physical evidence. The $3,000 I had stolen from Talbot's firebox was the nail in the coffin. When the police inevitably fingerprinted the envelope, they would find Talbot's prints all over it, perfectly corroborating my story that he had handed it to me. Are you hungry, honey? Valerie asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I'm okay, I replied softly. I'm used to being hungry. It was a subtle, calculated drop, a breadcrumb. Valerie's grip on the steering wheel tightened until her knuckles turned white. Well, you won't have to be hungry anymore, she said, her voice thick with suppressed emotion. We arrived at a sprawling brick building in the suburbs, a county intake center for displaced children. It was clinical, smelling of industrial cleaner and boiled vegetables, but to me it felt like the lobby of a luxury hotel. There was no Eleanor here to critique my existence. There was no Talbot to threaten me. Valerie processed my paperwork, marveling out loud to the intake nurse about the birth certificate and the cash. "It's unprecedented," I heard her whisper in the hallway. "They literally liquidated her from the family portfolio. Coldest thing I've ever seen." That night, I was placed in a small, clean room with 2 other sleeping toddlers. I lay on the stiff cot staring at the ceiling. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, replaced by a deep, terrifying exhaustion. I was a 25-year-old woman trapped in a preschooler's body. The physical limitations were maddening. I couldn't drive, I couldn't open a bank account, and I couldn't legally advocate for myself. But I had something far more dangerous than legal rights. I had time, and I had absolute, unadulterated foresight. I closed my eyes and began to map out the destruction of the family that had killed me. The next 48 hours were media circus. It started with a leak from the precinct. You can't arrest a prominent regional director of a Fortune 500 tech company and his socialite wife at a public rest stop without someone noticing. By Monday morning, the local news stations had picked up the story. Wealthy couple arrested for abandoning toddler with $3,000 severance pay. It was exactly the kind of sensational, enraging headline that the 2 4-hour news cycle feasted on. I was officially moved to a temporary foster placement with Mrs. Higgins, a stern but profoundly fair widow who fostered emergency cases. She didn't coddle me, which I appreciated, but she made sure I had 3 solid meals a day and a locked door at night. On Wednesday, Valerie came to visit me at Mrs. Higgins's house. She brought a man with her, a child psychologist named Dr. Aries Mercer. "Hello there, Doctor," Mercer said, taking a seat on the worn floral sofa across from me. He had a gentle, probing gaze. "I'm a doctor who talks to kids when things get confusing. Is it okay if we chat for a bit?" This was the crucible. If I acted too adult, I would be flagged as deeply disturbed or worse, a liar repeating a script. If I acted too childish, I would lose control of the narrative, and Talbot's high-priced lawyers might spin the situation as a misunderstanding. A hyperactive child who stole money and wandered off. I had to walk a razor's edge. I sat on the floor, deliberately playing with a set of wooden blocks, stacking them with methodical precision. "Do you know why you're here with Mrs. Higgins?" Dr. Mercer asked. "Because my old parents didn't have room in the budget for me anymore," I said, not looking up from my blocks. Dr. Mercer exchanged a sharp, alarmed look with Valerie. "Budget? That's a big word. Did your dad say that?" "He says it a lot," I replied, knocking down a red block and replacing it with a blue one. "He said Lily is a good investment because she looks like mommy. He told his friend on the phone that I was a sunk cost." "What is a sunk cost, Dr. Mercer?" I looked up at him, then widening my blue eyes in a perfect imitation of innocent confusion. I knew exactly what a sunk cost was. I also knew that Talbot, a pathological narcissist obsessed with his tech portfolios, used business jargon to describe human beings. Dr. Mercer cleared his throat, visibly shaken. It's a grown-up word for something you can't get back. But children aren't costs, sweetie. Eleanor says I cost her figure," I continued casually, referring to the minor stretch marks my mother had always blamed me for, despite her pristine post-pregnancy surgeries. "That's why she doesn't like holding my hand in public. It ruins the aesthetic." "Jesus," Valerie breathed out, covering her mouth. I spent the next hour carefully dismantling my parents' entire defense strategy. I didn't tell stories of physical beatings because there weren't many. Their abuse had been entirely emotional, medical, and psychological. Instead, I painted a picture of chilling, calculated neglect. I mentioned the locks on the pantry doors that I couldn't reach. I mentioned how Lily's medical file was thick, while mine only contained the bare minimum vaccination records necessary for preschool. By the time Dr. Mercer left, he looked physically ill. He had all the ammunition he needed to write a devastating psychological evaluation, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the abandonment at the rest stop wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment, but the climax of a deeply ingrained pattern of systemic emotional abuse. That Friday, the preliminary bail hearing took place. I wasn't there, but Mrs. Higgins had the news on the television while she chopped vegetables in the kitchen. I sat on the rug watching the screen intently. The camera panned to the county courthouse steps. Talbot and Eleanor emerged, surrounded by a swarm of reporters flashing cameras. They looked horrific. Talbot was wearing a wrinkled suit, his usually perfectly styled hair greasy and unkempt. Eleanor hid behind oversized sunglasses, her face pale and drawn. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of two narcissists who had suddenly lost control of their public image. Attorney Kessler was walking ahead of them shouting, "No comment," and trying to push through the throng of microphones. Then the anchor's voice cut in. Bail was set at a staggering $500,000 each, for the couple, with the judge citing them as an extreme flight risk, given their financial assets and the egregious nature of the charges. The state has formally petitioned for the termination of parental rights. Termination of parental rights. The words were a symphony to my ears. In my past life, I had begged them to love me. In this life, I was legally severing them from me before I even hit kindergarten. But I knew the war wasn't over. Talbot came from old, quiet money. His parents, Margaret and Winston, were formidable socialites who prized the family legacy above all else. They wouldn't care about me. They never had in my past life. But they would care deeply about the family name being dragged through the mud. Sure enough, the very next afternoon, Valerie arrived at Mrs. Higgins's house looking incredibly stressed. "We have a complication," Valerie said, sitting at the kitchen table with Mrs. Higgins while I listened from the hallway. "The paternal grandparents have hired a massive legal team. They're petitioning for immediate custody of the child to keep her in the family." "Are they fit?" Mrs. Higgins asked, frowning. "They're billionaires," Valerie scoffed bitterly. "They can buy fitness. They're offering to sweep this under the rug, put her in a private boarding school in Switzerland, and handle Talbot and Eleanor privately. The county is sweating. A legal battle with the grandparents will bankrupt the local CPS department." My blood ran cold. Switzerland, a boarding school. It was an elegant, expensive way to make me disappear forever. If Margaret and Winston got custody of me, I would be entirely under their control, isolated in a foreign country, my revenge thwarted. I couldn't let the state negotiate away my freedom. I needed to act, and I needed to do something entirely unprecedented for a 4-year-old. I needed my own lawyer, not just any lawyer. I needed a shark. I walked into the kitchen, clutching my worn blanket. Valerie looked down at me, her face softening into a pitying smile. "Valerie," I said, my voice steady, "I don't want to go with the grandparents. They smell like mothballs, and they hate my mom." Valerie sighed. "Oh, honey, I know. We're trying our best, but grown-up rules are complicated." "I saw a lady on the TV," I said, widening my eyes and projecting my voice so both women would hear me clearly. "She had red glasses and she yelled at a bad man in a suit. She said she protects kids. Can I have her?" Valerie blinked, confused. "A lady on TV. The news," I clarified. "A few days ago. The lady who works for the kids who don't have voices? CASA." I deliberately stumbled over the acronym, making it sound like CASA. "Her name was Rossi." Valerie froze. She stared at me, her jaw literally dropping. Attorney Evelyn Rossi was a legend in the state. She was a notoriously ruthless, high-profile child advocacy lawyer who took pro bono cases that involved systemic abuse by wealthy individuals. She was a media darling, a nightmare for defense attorneys, and exactly the person who could obliterate Talbot's parents in court. I remembered her from a massive class-action lawsuit she won in my past life in 2003. She wore iconic thick red-rimmed glasses. "Evelyn Rossi," Mrs. Higgins whispered, looking from me to Valerie, the civil rights attorney. How do you remember her name?" "Sweetheart," Valerie asked, her voice shaking slightly. "She has pretty glasses," I lied, shrugging my small shoulders. "And she looks strong. I want her to be my voice." "Please, Valerie. Can you call the strong lady?" Valerie stared at me for a long, heavy moment. She was a seasoned social worker. She knew when a child was extraordinarily bright, but this was bordering on the supernatural. Yet the sheer logic of the request of vulnerable child asking for the most famous protector in the state overrode her suspicion. I can try," Valerie stammered, pulling out her flip phone. "I can certainly try." I turned and walked back to the living room, a cold smile touching my lips. Let Margaret and Winston bring their corporate checkbooks. I was bringing a flamethrower. It took exactly 48 hours for Evelyn Rossi to descend upon my life. She arrived at Mrs. Higgins's house on a humid Tuesday morning, stepping out of a sleek silver town car. Even from the window, I could see she was a force of nature. She wore a sharp-tailored navy suit, carried a battered leather briefcase, and perched on her nose were her iconic thick red-rimmed glasses. She didn't wait in the living room for Valerie to fetch me. She walked straight into the kitchen where I was eating a bowl of oatmeal, pulled out a chair, and sat down opposite me. "Valerie tells me you asked for me by name," Evelyn said. Her voice was like crushed velvet over gravel, smooth but undeniably abrasive. She didn't use a baby voice. She didn't tilt her head with pity. She stared at me with intense, calculating dark eyes. I swallowed my oatmeal and wiped my mouth with a napkin. "I saw you on the television. You yelled at the bad men in suits. You made them pay." Evelyn leaned forward, resting her elbows on the formica table. "I only yell at people who deserve it, Hazel. And from the police report I just read, your parents deserve a lot more than yelling. But I need to know something. Did someone tell you to take that money and your birth certificate? A maid? A nanny?" "No," I replied, holding her gaze perfectly. "Talbot told his friend on the phone that I was a sunk cost. He kept my papers in a black box in his office. I knew he kept cash there for emergencies. When they decided to throw me away at the gas station, I took my severance." Evelyn didn't gasp like Valerie or the police officers had. Instead, a slow, terrifyingly sharp smile spread across her face. She recognized something in me, though she couldn't possibly understand what it was. She saw survival. She saw a tiny 4-year-old apex predator who had just orchestrated the downfall of her abusers. "Severance," Evelyn murmured, tasting the word. "You're a very smart little girl, Hazel. Too smart for the people who raised you. Your grandparents, Winston and Margaret, have filed an emergency petition for custody. They want to ship you off to a boarding school in Geneva to hide the family shame. Do you want to go to Geneva?" "I want Talbot and Eleanor to never see me again," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "And I don't want Winston and Margaret. They didn't know I existed until it was on the news." Evelyn stood up, snapping her briefcase shut. "Then they won't get you. I'm taking your case pro bono. We have an emergency injunction hearing on Friday. I am going to gut them in that courtroom." The media frenzy reached a boiling point by Thursday. News vans camped outside the county courthouse. The headline, "Top Civil Rights Attorney Evelyn Rossi represents Severance toddler against billionaire grandparents," dominated the state networks. Public opinion was a beautiful, destructive weapon, and Evelyn knew exactly how to wield it. Friday morning, the courtroom was heavily guarded, closed to cameras, but packed with legal aides and child welfare advocates. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Evelyn. I was dressed in a simple, neat blue dress Mrs. Higgins had bought for me, looking every bit the innocent, discarded child. Across the aisle sat Winston and Margaret. They looked like royalty who had been forced to step in mud. Winston wore a bespoke charcoal suit, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. Margaret sat stiffly, a silk scarf tied around her neck, refusing to even look in my direction. Flanking them were 3 high-priced corporate litigators, led by a slick silver-haired attorney named Preston. Preston stood up first, addressing Judge Corcoran. "Your Honor, this is a tragedy of maternal postpartum stress and paternal exhaustion. My clients, the paternal grandparents, are pillars of the community. They have immense resources. They are prepared to offer Hazel a life of unparalleled privilege, private therapy, and a secure environment away from this media circus. Kinship placement is always preferred by the state." "A life of privilege," Evelyn repeated, standing up slowly. She adjusted her red glasses, staring dead at Preston. "Your Honor, kinship placement is preferred when the kin actually views the child as kin and not as a public relations liability to be managed offshore." Evelyn walked toward the center of the courtroom. "Mr. Preston paints a lovely picture of a loving family stepping in to heal a broken child. Let's look at the reality. Since Hazel was taken into emergency custody exactly 14 days ago, Winston and Margaret have not requested a single visitation, not one phone call to her foster mother, not one stuffed animal sent. They didn't even know her favorite color when my office deposed them yesterday." Winston shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "They do not want a grandchild, Your Honor." Evelyn's voice rose, echoing off the wood paneled walls. "They want to bury a scandal. But it gets much, much worse because the abandonment at the rest stop wasn't just exhaustion. It was the disposal of an asset that had outlived its primary function." The courtroom fell dead silent. Even I looked up at Evelyn, my pulse quickening. I knew what was coming next, and it was the ultimate twist I had prepared for her. "Objection, Your Honor," Preston barked, leaping to his feet. "Counsel is making inflammatory and baseless allegations." "Overruled," Judge Corcoran said, his brow furrowed as he leaned over the bench. "I want to hear where Miss Rossi is going with this." "Proceed, counsel." Evelyn walked back to our table and opened her briefcase. She pulled out a thick, cream-colored file folder. It wasn't my birth certificate. It was the secondary file I had grabbed from Talbot's firebox, the one tucked behind Lily's passport. In my past life, I hadn't understood what was in it until I was a teenager, bleeding out on a hospital bed. In this life, I had handed it directly to Evelyn Rossi. When my client had the sheer survival instinct to empty her father's lockbox before she was abandoned, she didn't just grab her birth certificate and emergency cash, Evelyn said, holding the folder up. She grabbed this a medical and genetic profile commissioned by Talbot and Eleanor before Hazel was even conceived. Eleanor, who had been brought up from the holding cells and seated at the far end of the defense table in a bright orange jumpsuit, suddenly let out a strangled gasp. Talbot slammed his hands on the table, his face draining of all color. "What is that document, Miss Rossi?" the judge asked, his voice hardening. "It is a contract with a private genetics facility, Your Honor." Along with comprehensive blood typing and tissue matching reports, Evelyn stated, her voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "Hazel's older sister, Lily, suffers from a congenital renal defect, a condition that will inevitably require a kidney transplant by the time she reaches her 20s. Talbot and Eleanor deliberately conceived Hazel through selective IVF purely to create a genetic match, a savior sibling." Pandemonium erupted at the defense table. Talbot was shouting at his lawyer. Margaret put a hand over her mouth, looking at her son in horror. Winston looked like he was going to have a stroke. "Your Honor, the documents clearly outline the medical timeline." Evelyn continued over the noise. "Hazel was never viewed as a daughter. She was an insurance policy, a spare parts repository. And recently, Lily's specialist confirmed that her condition has stabilized and a transplant may not be necessary for decades, if at all. Hazel was no longer an urgent medical necessity. She was just a sunk cost, as Talbot so eloquently described her to his associates." Judge Corcoran struck his gavel violently. "Order, order in my courtroom." The room fell into a stunned, sickening silence. I sat perfectly still, staring at my hands. The memory of the scalpel slicing into my back in my previous life flashed through my mind, a phantom pain that made my breath hitch. They had stolen my organ, ruined my health, and let me die. This was my justice. I was exposing the blueprint of my own murder before they could execute it. "Mr. Preston," Judge Corcoran said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust, "are your clients, the grandparents, aware of this genetic harvesting scheme?" Preston was stammering, visibly sweating. "Your Honor, this is the first we are seeing of these documents. My clients, your clients fund Talbot's trust, which paid the $500,000 medical bills to the private genetics clinic." Evelyn interrupted smoothly, handing the financial ledgers to the bailiff. Winston signed the authorizations himself to avoid the money being taxed. They knew exactly why this child was brought into the world, and they fully supported throwing her away when she was no longer deemed a necessary medical asset. Winston stood up, pointing a trembling finger at Evelyn. "That is a lie. We paid medical bills for Lily. We didn't know what Talbot was doing with the IVF clinic. You're a billionaire with an army of accountants." Winston Evelyn shot back. "You don't accidentally fund a boutique genetic selection facility. You knew you are entirely complicit in the commodification and subsequent abandonment of your own granddaughter." Evelyn turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, placing Hazel in the custody of this family is tantamount to returning a piece of stolen property to a cartel. They do not want to raise her. They want to control her, silence her, and keep her organs on standby in a Swiss boarding school just in case Lily's condition worsens. I am filing a motion for the immediate and permanent severance of all parental and familial rights of the entire biological family, and petitioning for Hazel to become a ward of the state under my firm's direct protective oversight until a safe permanent adoption can be finalized." The judge looked down at me. For a moment, the stern, terrifying mask of the courtroom dissolved and he just looked like a profoundly heartbroken father. "Motion granted," Judge Corcoran said, his gavel coming down with a final echoing crack. Winston and Margaret's petition for custody is denied with extreme prejudice. Talbot and Eleanor's parental rights are permanently severed, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am forwarding these medical documents to the district attorney to see if additional charges of child endangerment and medical exploitation can be added to their criminal indictments. As the base moved in to escort Talbot and Eleanor back to their cells, Eleanor turned and looked at me. Her eyes were wide, terrified, and devoid of the haughty arrogance she had worn like armor for 25 years. She finally realized what I was. I wasn't her victim anymore. I was her executioner. I looked back at her, gave a slow, deliberate blink, and turned away. I grabbed my red backpack and reached up, taking Evelyn Rossi's hand. We walked out of the courtroom together, the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind us, locking my abusers inside the hell they had built for themselves. I was 4 years old. A multi-million-dollar trust fund of my own awaited me, thanks to the ensuing civil lawsuits Evelyn would file. And for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I was completely, beautifully free. The aftermath of the custody hearing was a masterclass in scorched earth litigation. Evelyn Rossi didn't just win my freedom. She actively dismantled the dynasty that had tried to erase me. Faced with the threat of the genetic harvesting documents being unsealed in a sprawling, highly publicized civil trial, Winston and Margaret capitulated. To protect their remaining social standing and their corporate empire, they agreed to a closed-door settlement. The sum was astronomical. An 8-figure trust fund established in my name, inaccessible to anyone but me, with Evelyn appointed as the legal trustee until I turned 18. Talbot and Eleanor's fate was far less comfortable. The district attorney, armed with Evelyn's findings, pressed criminal charges. Talbot's high-priced lawyers couldn't save him from the undeniable paper trail. He and Eleanor were convicted of felony reckless endangerment, financial fraud for misappropriating family trust funds to pay the shadow clinics, and severe child abuse. They were each sentenced to 6 years in a federal penitentiary. I didn't go to their sentencing. I was busy picking out paint colors for my new bedroom. I wasn't put into the foster system. In a move that surprised everyone, including herself, Evelyn Rossi filed for permanent legal guardianship. I don't do playdates, Hazel, Evelyn told me the day I moved into her sprawling modern penthouse overlooking the city. She adjusted her red-rimmed glasses, looking down at me with her usual piercing intensity. And I don't bake cookies, but I know how to fight, and I know how to survive. If you want to learn how to be untouchable, you can stay. I want to learn, I had replied, looking at the city's skyline. Growing up with Evelyn was exactly what a traumatized, reincarnated 25-year-old needed. She didn't treat me like a fragile child. She treated me like an apprentice. While other kids were learning the alphabet, I was sitting in the corner of her home office, reading redacted case files and learning about asset protection, hostile takeovers, and the intricate, beautiful machinery of the legal system. I grew up ruthless, brilliant, and completely devoid of the desperate need for validation that had killed me in my first life. I used my settlement money to aggressively invest in tech startups and distressed debt, applying the adult foresight I possessed to multiply my wealth exponentially. By the time I was 22, I had graduated at the top of my law school class. I didn't join a corporate firm. I joined Evelyn. We became the most feared legal duo in the state. But I always knew a countdown was ticking in the background. Lily's kidneys. In my past life, her renal failure had triggered my death at 25. I knew exactly when the genetic time bomb in her body was destined to go off. I spent years preparing for it, not to save her, but to finalize the absolute destruction of the people who thought they could harvest me. July 12th, the exact date of my abandonment. The exact date I died in my previous life. I was now 25 years old. I was sitting in my corner office at Rossi & Associates, looking over a merger contract when my private line rang. Only a handful of people had the number. I picked it up. Hazel. The voice was older, raspy, and practically trembling with desperation. But I recognized it instantly. Talbot. He and Eleanor had been released from prison years ago. Their reputations were in ruins, their wealth seized by the IRS to pay back taxes and the massive fines levied against them. Winston and Margaret had publicly disowned them before passing away, leaving their remaining fortune to charity. Talbot had spent the last decade trying to claw his way back to the top, running a string of failing logistics startups. "How did you get this number, Talbot?" I asked, my voice as cold and smooth as glass. "Please don't hang up," he begged. The arrogance that had once defined him was completely eroded. It's Lily. She's an end-stage renal failure. She's at Mount C. She needs a transplant immediately, and she's a rare tissue match. The registry is empty. Hazel, you're her only hope. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring out at the city. The sheer breathtaking audacity of it all. 21 years of absolute silence. And they only reached out when they needed a spare part. I know we made mistakes, Talbot babbled, his voice cracking. I know we failed you, but Lily didn't do anything wrong. She's your sister. Please, Hazel, name your price. I'll give you anything. You don't have anything to give, Talbot, I said quietly. I have a company, Braftoft Logistics. It's finally turning a profit. I'll sign the whole thing over to you. Just come to the hospital, let them test you. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was time. The trap I had spent a decade building was finally snapping shut. Braftoft Logistics, I mused, opening a file on my desk. A mid-tier freight company currently drowning in $4.2 million of high-interest mezzanine debt. Debt that was recently purchased by a private equity holding firm called Vanguard Horizon? There was a dead, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. How? How do you know that? Talbot whispered, the panic returning to his voice. Because Vanguard Horizon is a subsidiary of my trust, Talbot, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. I own your debt. And at 900 a.m. this morning, I filed the paperwork to call in the loan. Your company is currently being seized for liquidation. You are bankrupt again. No, you can't. As for Lily, I continued, cutting him off. My medical records are sealed under a heavily guarded federal injunction. My tissue profile has been legally barred from ever entering any national or international registry. And I have a standing restraining order against you, Eleanor and Lily, that will trigger an immediate arrest if any of you come within 500 yards of me. Hazel, she's going to die. Talbot screamed, the sound tearing through the phone. She is, I agreed, my tone entirely flat. And you are going to watch it happen, knowing that the cure is alive, thriving, and utterly untouchable. You built me to be a spare part, Talbot. But I became the machine that crushed you. You're a monster, he sobbed. No, I replied softly. I'm just the consequence of your actions. Goodbye, Talbot. I hung up the phone. I didn't feel a shred of guilt. I didn't feel sad. I reached for my coffee mug, taking a slow, warm sip. My kidney pulsed steadily in my own back, exactly where it belonged. The karma was brutal, hard, and absolutely perfectly executed. I had been reborn from the ashes of their cruelty. And today, the fire was finally put out. The monitor in my office hummed a quiet, steady rhythm, a stark contrast to the flatline that ended my first life. I had rewritten my destiny, turning a narrative of victimhood into an empire of hard-won justice. Talbot and Eleanor were ghosts of a past I had successfully exorcised, left to drown in the consequences of their own monstrous greed. Blood does not make a family. Respect, loyalty, and fierce protection do. I survived the fire they threw me into, and from the ashes, I forged a life they could never touch. Thank you for walking through this journey of survival and karma with